Queridos amigos, ¿cómo están? En esta ocasión tengo el placer de presentarles a Douglas Murray. La presentación de su perfil ya la hice al inicio, una presentación escrita. Es un autor muy prolífico, británico, un comentarista político de gran nivel, un conservador muy, muy fuerte, es un representante del movimiento conservador anglosajón, muy, muy potente. Ha sido un íntimo amigo de Sir Roger Scruton, quien nos dejó lamentablemente en enero del año pasado. Así que creo que estamos en las manos de una persona que tiene una visión integral de las cosas y su opinión siempre es muy escuchada en el mundo anglosajón y ahora quería presentarlo un poco en el mundo hispanoparlante. Así que ahora voy a pasar a hablar en inglés para no faltarle el respeto a nuestro invitado. So, dear Douglas, thank you very much for accepting this interview. It's a pleasure for me. It's an honor. I am a huge follower of your work, of your interviews, and I appreciate the clarity, the strength, and the courage that you have to when you express your opinions in this world of political correctness. So thank you very much for being with us here.
Well, it's a great pleasure. Let me say, first of all, apologies for having very, very basic Spanish and not being able to converse with you in Spanish. But secondly, thank you for your warm introduction. And not at all. It's a pleasure as well as a duty to do what I do.
Thank you very much. So, well, let's delve into the issues right now. And the first question would be, there are so many things to talk about. If you could translate what the Great Reset means, what do you get from the Great Reset? How do you simplify this concept into what's happening now?
Oh gosh, that's diving straight into a minefield. My own view is that I've actually not written about this at great length so far. I've looked into it a fair amount, though. There are several things going on. The Great Reset, as a phrase, suffers from the same problems as some other phrases of our time, fake news, for instance, in that there is a thing that is being described, and then there is a thing that has come apart from it, which is what other people think it is or make it out to be. In the case of fake news, there is such a thing as, for instance, news that people select that fits their own worldview and therefore ignores other things. And then there are just totally fake stories. But this has become divorced. This actual problem has become divorced from that trend and has become a sort of political weapon that both sides utilize against each other. I think that the Great Reset's got a similar problem. The head of the World Economic Forum, when he talked about this and wrote about it last year, was talking about a very specific thing. Since then, because we've all spent a year in various forms of quarantine and house seclusion because of COVID, this phrase, Great Reset, has also become separated from the thing which was first described, and I think is at risk also of becoming a sort of political football where both sides can use it depending on their own interpretations. And I mention that only because there is a considerable likelihood at a juncture like this that people will fall into conspiracy theory, for instance. So you see, the problem is that so many world leaders have used the phrase the Great Reset that it starts to sound like world leaders have got together and agreed on a policy. Now, as it happens, Schwab and others have clearly got something in mind, which he writes about perfectly openly. But I don't believe that there is a great coordinated policy of all the world's leaders to do anything much beyond that. That said, there's a third thing that I think the Great Reset could yet be, which is the necessity of governments to get out of the Corona era by agreeing on, I would have thought the most obvious one is what to do with debt. And so we will have the Great Reset as laid out by the head of the World Economic Forum. We will have what people think the Great Reset is, and then we will have what it actually consists of. But within that, I say it like that because I just think it's very important to keep in mind the reality of what is being discussed and proposed, and some feverish fears about it, which are legitimate fears, but may well run off in their own direction.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thank you. I have a different opinion. This is not the moment to express it. My viewers. No, I do think it is a coordinated policy. The messages are like transversal in every. It's not only the state. It's not only governments, but the private sector. Big companies,
right?
Investment funds, big tech, universities, NGOs. It's like too many actors, and then you think in such a short time span, how do you get to repeat the same kind of discourse and the policy packages that come with that discourse?
Yes.
Reinterpreting our economic life. There was actually a book that was written and published last year in July by Thierry Maleret and Klaus Schwab, which was COVID-19 and the Great Reset.
Yes.
Where they explained what could we expect in the future. So they said, okay, in terms of state and politics, you can expect a more interventionist state. So states will make decisions also in terms of what can you produce, what can you sell. A very interventionist state. Taxes will be raised.
Sure.
Taxes will be raised in order to fill up that huge debt that has been created. The state has been, bailing out people and these stimulus packages. So you will have more taxes, more taxes. In terms of the economy, they said, well, it won't work in capitalism as we understood it, because that's a central aspect of the Great Reset. Is capitalism is agonizing. It has been so destructive to Mother Nature. Yes. That we have to take care of.
This is a bit that, obviously got some political unanimity from various elected and unelected world leaders.
Exactly.
By the way, just one thing. I took what Schwab was saying there not to be prescriptive completely. I may be wrong in this, but I took it to be, apart from anything else, a sort of observation of the likely direction of travel rather than a manifesto, shall we say?
Yes. No, you're
other people
right.
might disagree with that, but that was what I took away from it.
No, you're absolutely right. That's how the book is presented. It's not. It's a normative, not prescriptive.
Yeah,
prescriptive. It is in normative terms.
Yes.
But
by the way, so very quickly, if I may, the issue on taxation is very important, because an observer is very likely to say, as a descriptive matter, that in order to get out of the debt situation we're in, with unbelievable historic borrowing and just catastrophic fall off in GDP in all of our countries, it's hard to see how you get out of that without raising taxes. However, there is obviously, and I hope that in my own country, Great Britain, where we all have we have a bit of we have the possibility to be able to act in a more unilateral manner than certain other countries. I hope that we go in the other direction and, to whatever extent possible, make sure that on top of the financial situation we're in, we don't make it even worse by hiking up the tax burden.
Exactly.
So, I think these options remain in front of us. And I didn't mean to interrupt, but just to say that I think it's important, because there's a risk of fatalism, particularly among conservatives, looking at what Schwab and others have been saying, as if what they say, therefore, is not just an observation of the likely trajectory and of their own desire, but of what we are inevitably going to go through. And I think that it is absolutely imperative that we recognize that these things are not fixed.
Okay. Well, again, I would be in the camp of the fatalists that you are talking about, in the sense of the very, very, I will say, as Sir Roger Scruton said, I'm a responsible pessimist.
Sure. Oh yeah. No, that's very necessary. Pessimists almost always get proved right.
Yes.
But I do think on this issue of the Great Reset, we have to be very careful to know what we're talking about. I think that there is that's why I say that the thing that has been advocated by Justin Trudeau and the Prince of Wales and a bewildering number of people. It's not, by the way, bewildering that political and other leaders use the same language swiftly one after the other. It is a tendency in our era. A phrase appears in Davos and swiftly is heard in
Yes,
Toronto, London,
build
everywhere.
back better.
Yeah,
another one.
Build Back Better was absolutely. So, they get these phrases and then they all come out with them. But I don't particularly see that as some people on the right do, as a signal of strength of that crowd. I see it as a signal of very distinct weakness. Just having to echo similarly bland and empty phrases. I don't think this shows strength in the sort of Davos mind.
Okay, well, beyond our healthy discrepancy, but I truly appreciate the fact that you have at least, and I agree with you, it would be very healthy, mentally healthy and physically healthy, to give us a little bit more hope and try to compartmentalize, as you have done, the concept, depending on the point of view that you have, how do you approach this Great Reset concept. Now, you have written a number of books, all of them with high acclaim, very well received by the people. In Spanish, the one that you published, La extraña muerte de Europa, which was published, I think, in 2016, if my mind doesn't betray. Yes, 17, where you talk about the dissolution, the gradual dissolution, if we can summarize this, the gradual dissolution of the West in its foundational terms, in institutional terms, cultural terms, and that gained you the label of Islamophobe, which is I think is absolutely appalling because it's not true. But
I think I'd gained it before that, but I think it's cemented.
It was cemented. Let's put it that way. It was cemented by then. Yes, because you were participating in several dialogues and debates in TV before that.
Sure.
And then you came up with a very powerful book, which is La Masa Enardecida. That's the translation, the 2019 book, where you talk basically about identity politics in 4 big areas. Gender, race, the trans issue, and women. Those were the 4, and how political correctness is just doing more harm than well to these camps of. What do you think will happen? Let's forget about the Great Reset and think the current state of the world right now. Do you think these agendas will strengthen? Do you think these agendas will dissolve in time, or what's your view on this? Because this is a huge preoccupation for Latin American people, with issues like family, roles of men and women, sex are very, very traditional approaches. So what's your take on this one?
Yes. I know Latin America a bit, and spent quite a lot of time in Spain in my life, and have a lot of friends in all of these places. And I think my own observation is that Spanish-speaking countries, for instance, are suffering from the overspill of America's culture wars. That's really what is going on. I happen to be, by instinct and experience, rather pro-American. I always have been since I went there at the age of 17 or 18 to research my first book. I have always tended to view America as a force for good in the world, or at least certainly a force that is more a force for good than any of the other competitors who might wish to take up that mantle. Yes. However, on the issue of culture and culture wars, America, I think, is now toxifying much of the international debate. One of the reasons why the English-speaking countries are rather further down the road in the crowd madness that I describe in my most recent book is that we simply get, by dint of language, apart from anything else, the first press of all of the American culture wars. So the moment that people start pulling down statues in America, we get it the next weekend in the UK, for instance. It's a very interesting question as to why other countries get it slightly further down the road. I am persuaded that part of it is a language thing. But more significantly, it's a cultural thing, that the English-speaking countries do have some cultural similarities still that mean that when one society is particularly vulnerable to a new craze, the others fall into line as well. My own observation is that Spanish-speaking countries, by and large, are slightly more immune to it, but by no means immune. That the claims of everything being racist and about colonialism and about reparations and everything else, all of these things are are just as capable of washing across Latin America, Spain, and elsewhere. And I think there are some defense mechanisms that are in place. But really, I think that Spanish-speaking people should know what is coming to them, because it is coming. It's come slightly later, but it comes anyway. There is what I would think of as being a sort of irresistible force in these movements, which, if you don't know what they are and you don't know how to address them, will cause you to be, at the very least, on the back foot, and at the worst, completely subsumed by these crazes.
Well, it's very interesting what you say. I agree. There's no secure immunity against this. I would say it's openly a disease. Not the topics of the agenda, but the agenda itself. Because I totally favor freedom of expression, of identity, and people can do with their lives whatever they want to do. It's the imposition of those agendas that exacerbates and enrages people. Now, let's see. For instance, in the last U.S. election, it was Biden who came out. You cannot comment about the outcome of that election, so I won't do it. I have a view on that also, but Biden is the president. That's the fact. The first week he was in power, 37 executive orders. He was just going crazy with this whole thing.
Yes.
Now, and this is a cultural issue for us in Latin America. The role, for example, that agencies like Planned Parenthood have are very, very important. Abortion is a huge, very, very sensitive topic for us. And the first thing he did was, to re-empower Planned Parenthood. And what do you think beyond these topics of gender, race, identity? What can we expect beyond these agendas from a Biden presidency in the U.S. in this call for China for multilateralism? And what's the role of the U.S.? Is it a declining power or not, in your view?
Well, my view is that we are at a very crucial tipping point on the global scales. As you know, I mean, China is the only major global economy to have come out of 2020 with reported growth.
It's magic.
I'm very skeptical about everything to do with this, and very worried about the lack of interrogation of facts like this and how they've come about. I think there's nothing that's beneath the Chinese Communist Party to do. So this troubles me greatly. And of course, China was actually losing a trade war with Donald Trump's administration before the era of Corona hit. I believe that there is a huge challenge for all of us. We might well be in a form of very, very late stage, let's say, American hegemony. And maybe effectively, I mean, I don't think this is, again, inevitable, but particularly a lot of young people influenced by the American culture wars, I think maybe in the process of trying to kill the goose that laid the golden egg.
Yeah, I agree.
And what would come next? The only major competitor to American hegemony is Chinese hegemony. It's the only country that's likely to capable of overtaking the US economy in the years ahead, and is in a very strong position to do so. In that, one of the curiosities of the corner that we are in globally is that at this stage, at this juncture, so much energy in the free world is spent on crazy late stage issues and debates and dissents and fallouts, whilst this very, very sinister power, the Chinese Communist Party, is eating everybody's lunch. I find the whole thing to be, and obviously I spend a certain amount of my time, writing and talking about these issues, but I do so saying what I want to happen is for people to get over these cultural battles as fast as possible, or at least find a way to park them in order to get on with the more meaningful things that they should be doing. It won't matter at all if you've got all of your pronouns perfectly in a row, if the Chinese Communist Party ends up being the most powerful force in the world. It wouldn't matter at all if you think you've really nixed the gender question. It's not as if the Chinese Communist Party cares about racism. It's not as if the Chinese Communist Party gives a damn about anything like that. So there's a very curious thing about the juncture we're at, and it's a question of priorities. And one of my priorities has been to urge people to separate out the meaningful and the distracting. Try to get past the distracting as fast as possible, and to get on to the meaningful.
Yes, and it's you're talking. I fully agree with that, with your view in that sense. While we are thinking about gender questions, they are preparing students for physics, science, mathematics.
Yeah.
They are just in a whole different level. And now there's also an issue that I think for the first time in China's history, since the arrival of Xi Jinping 2013. With these new Silk Road plans, you can see for the first time in history an expansionist China. China was always a country or empire that looked inwards. But this is a tipping point again. This is a China that looks beyond its borders.
Yeah.
What do you think are the risks, of the obvious risks at some point associated to this kind of expansionism?
Well, I mean, we see it with the policies that China pursues with, historic challengers and opponents. I mean, the attempts that the Chinese have made to subvert, for instance, international institutions like the World Health Organization against Taiwan.
Yes,
these are actually very successful campaigns that they have run. There's obviously a debate, and there has been one going on for a long time, about exactly what it is that the CCP wants. And what the limitations to its ambitions might or might not be. But we can certainly see that it started to stretch its legs in the last year. Look at the way in which Chinese Communist Party has treated the Australian government, for instance. Attempts to, it's very interesting seeing a power that is used to bullying Taiwan, for instance, use the same tactics on a Five Eyes country like Australia. It's definitely shown itself, the CCP, in the last year, to be willing to push people around and try to get away with it in a fashion which I think is a new. It's got new targets, I would say, in mind, and I think it should worry everybody. As for other things, this seems to me to be the big question for the Biden administration. Is it able to take on the legitimate concerns that the Trump administration had, and the successes that the Trump administration, whatever you think of Trump, the successes that the administration had in recognizing the force that China is today, in recognizing its ambitions, and trying to ensure, apart from anything else, that it was recognized as a competitor, and as, among many other things, one of the most severe human rights violator in the world. But again, we get back to this very strange thing. If you again, we mustn't all get caught up in America's culture wars, but if you just did a vox pop in the streets of America, I can assure you that, to the extent that people know about human rights, for instance, they will talk about a woman's right to choose in America, and they will talk about a range of the social issues that obsess them, and the almost half of young people who think racism in America is a serious problem, and much more. And they will know nothing about the Chinese Communist Party's repression of the Uyghurs. They will know nothing about the way in which the Chinese Communist Party imprisons and tortures its opponents and disappears booksellers in Hong Kong, and has done. They won't know anything about that. And they're not, and this is a question, they're not interested in it really either, because they have been educated into a form of imbecility as well as arrogance that believes that everything in the world that goes wrong must go wrong because America is responsible. And they're not interested in the fact that other things in the world can happen and can go very, very badly wrong with no American involvement whatsoever.
Well, it's interesting also because I tend, of course, I'm a Westerner by several measures, and On the other side, to be fair, also there has been a lot of misinformation from Western mainstream media about the Chinese culture and the Chinese politics. So I think it has been a two-way road.
That's right.
But I do fully agree with your views that China is not an exemplar for many parameters, including human rights and freedom of speech and these kind of things, which are inexistent basically. Now, there's an issue about China, which brings me to the next question, and I would like to make that connection. China has become a global tech power in its own right. You have companies like Alibaba, Tencent, Baidu, which are giants. Alibaba dwarfs Amazon in terms of sales. It's 10 times bigger. It's such a massive machine of technology, and they have developed capabilities in artificial intelligence, in nanotech, in biotech. And we know what's going on in China right now with the surveillance state. It's a factual. It's a factual thing. It's not a conspiracy theory. China is right now a surveillance state regulated by technology. Now, in the West, you have companies like Google, like Amazon, Facebook, G Mafia, as some mentioned, G Mafia. And these companies, they have flexed their muscle. Trump, in the case of Trump with Twitter, then in Facebook, the case of Facebook bullying the Australian government right now.
Absolutely. Amazing sight.
Incredible. So this takes me to the next question. What's going on with big tech? These are private companies that are exercising governmental-like powers.
Yes.
They're regulating citizenship rights. What's your take here?
First, let me just separate them out. Firstly, I mean, in terms of Chinese companies, you're completely right. And most people have woken up far too late to the issue, the threat, I would say, that Chinese companies pose within free societies. When my own country of birth, the United Kingdom, was going through a debate last year about whether or not part of our 5G network should be built by Huawei, I was I happened to be traveling in Latin America at one point when the debate was at its most feverish, and was, every airport I went through had huge Huawei signs everywhere. They were already there. And I relayed this to a friend in Westminster, and I said, it was a reminder that everyone had woken up late.
Yes.
Whether too late or not, I don't know, but late, definitely. As for the sort of Silicon Valley tech firms, there are a number of ways in which you can read it. Here's what I think has happened. I think that the companies started with no more bad intent than is average. I don't think that Mark Zuckerberg or Jack Dorsey or any of the other people, I don't think they ever expected to be in the position they are now.
I agree.
Everything along the way has amazed them, and they have had to catch up, and they've always caught up slow. And again, from the outside, whether you're positive about these companies or negative, there is a tendency to attribute to them capabilities that they just don't demonstrate that they have. I say this in regards to freedom of speech issues. All of our countries have been through freedom of speech debates for centuries. None of it is new. We have all, in the developed world, been, and elsewhere, we have all been going through for centuries debates about the free press, criticism of government, what shouting fire in a crowded theater actually means, and much more. We've been through this. There's not a journalist in any of our countries who couldn't tell you what the outlines of the problem are. And the question is, it's not a problem, it's a question. Now, Google, Facebook, and others behave as if nobody has ever thought about any of these things before. They behave as if they're starting from scratch, as if these aren't problems and questions that have been gone over by the free press and others for centuries. And as I said in a recent piece about Facebook, watching them trying to talk about free speech is to steal a quote from one of my favorite authors, Evelyn Waugh, is like watching a Sèvres vase in the hands of a chimpanzee. I mean, they have no idea what they're doing. They're sort of they're toying with this thing that they are eminently capable of breaking. Something they're doing all the time. So I think they found themselves in a position of extraordinary power. I mean, power that makes Gutenberg look relatively small as a development by comparison. And they don't know what they're doing. And every time they suck up any advice, it seems to make things worse. And I think that the developments that have been going on in the last couple of years in particular are deeply, deeply sinister. I regard it as being the case that perhaps the most left-wing few square miles on planet Earth, Silicon Valley, is effectively attempting to roll out its worldview globally. It regards its worldview as the correct one. It regards all of the others as incorrect, particularly any conservative worldview. And it believes that we, the populations, are sort of slow learners who have to catch up with Silicon Valley. And this is very, very sinister. It's a very dangerous juncture, and it's one which we must learn how to resist at the corners of it. We've got to not allow ourselves to be subsumed into a worldview which is being forced upon us. And if I may say so, what I say in my latest book at one point is that the deeply sinister thing is not just that these companies can manipulate the present. We spend quite a lot of time concentrating on that. We can see the way in which, for instance, they can muffle, silence, and eventually mute a US president
with a click.
With a click. Now we know that, and there's a lot to be said about that. To some extent, I regard it as being even more sinister that they can now also change the past.
Yes.
And you know,
historical revisionism.
Exactly. You know this, and I know this. But for instance, when it comes to a vision of what our societies were like in centuries past, the tech companies have decided to rewrite the history. They've decided to change the understanding of the people who were in that society. They have decided to rewrite the noble legacies of these societies so that, for instance, anyone who was on the correct side, as they see it, on the range of social issues like LGBT, women's rights, race equality, and so on, are the heroes. And everybody else in the history of the country who happens not to have been on side with those things, in the 17th century and elsewhere, are regarded as reprobates and effectively erased. And I think this is, in fact, for conservatives in particular, the most sinister thing, because anyone who's a conservative knows that understanding our past is central to understanding who we are in the present. And the left always try to rewrite the past. They've tried most spectacularly for the last 1.5 centuries. But conservatives are always at a disadvantage in that fight. But we are at a monumental disadvantage when people are being taught a version of our past, which is itself totally without grounding in reality, where our great histories, our great heroes, our great military heroes, our great kings and queens and military leaders and much more are sort of an embarrassment. And this is again following on from an American political war in which it seems that America now regards nobody present at its founding as being of any worth.
Exactly.
In fact, as reprehensible, because once you've chucked out George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and many more, what have you got? And my point is, it's the same with all of our societies now. Yeah. And I think that societies have the right to be, cultures have the right to be proud of the people who got them there. And this is the case with every country. Every country is conserving a different set of things. It's conserving a different history, a different set of traditions.
That's true diversity, actually. That's true
diversity, absolutely. And I, personally speaking, I think it's one of the things that instinctively makes some people more conservative than others. Personally, I wouldn't want it any other way. I don't want every country in Latin America or the Mediterranean Europe to be telling the same stories and running the same boring set of memes as Silicon Valley is imposing on everyone in the English-speaking world. I don't want it. I think all of these countries have fascinating and rich histories and cultures, and I want that. I want that to be present. I don't want this universal bland rewriting.
Yes, this cultural pride. That's the kind of pride that we want. This cultural pride, which resonates strongly in among Latin Americans, because we are very, very proud of our history, our heritage.
And rightly so. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's one of the most important things. There's nothing wrong with it.
Exactly, and to set up what could you say, deficiencies or vices to people that lived 300 years ago. It's just it's anachronism, and and ignorance. It is how I see this thing. It's an arrogant ignorance to claim that you have the right worldview. This comes also, I think, they feel empowered with this technological prowess that they have, these technological developments or technological progress, and they think that technological progress has to come with moral progress, but their moral as a. Do you understand? This is, for me, if you are not in line with our morality, you are a bigot, you are a Nazi, you are a homophobic, Islamophobic, or whatever. This is pretty troubling. I don't know if you would like to complement that.
Well, you're completely right. But this is because a version of history is being taught in all of our countries to greater or lesser extent, which sees the history of our countries as a history solely of emancipation.
Exactly.
Emancipation, first of all, of the citizenry from the kings and princes, then emancipation of the working classes, then emancipation of women, then emancipation of gay people, emancipation of ethnic minorities, and so on and so on. But this is only one story. This is only one story in history. It's one that you can play several different ways around. But, it is not the sole story of any of our countries, and it is being taught as if it is. And of course, the danger of it, as you know, and any conservative must know, the danger of it is that it, among other things, says that is how history will continue to have to be. And that's why we have this strange phenomenon of people scurrying around to find the next rights battles to fight viciously. Because they find meaning and historical purpose.
The next victims.
That's why we have the unicorn of our era, the black trans woman. This is like unicorn chasing. People talk about black trans people. There are black trans people. They're a very distinct minority. But so what? I mean, almost nobody wishes anyone harm. Very, very few people. So why this obsession? Because people hooked on a history of emancipation wish to find an incredibly small minority of people and pretend that the situation for those people is other than that it is, and that therefore a situation must occur where you fight as hard as people in previous generations did for instance, the franchise. So actually, I think that the history of emancipation that the left has been pushing has a palpably negative influence and impact on our societies today. And I think it is a job, among other things, of conservatives and others to say, no, here is a counter narrative, which can also give you purpose and meaning and make you feel pride. But I simply think we need to resist this. I recognize the history of emancipation as being of significance, but there are many other histories as well. And when I hear the radical left talking about our societies in these lights, I find it, among other things, just exceptionally boring. It's not of great interest to me.
They have field humor.
Yes, and I think that societies, at the very least, should be as interested in the great military victories they had, the great social advances they made, the great scientific advances, the great culture that they produced, all of which should be able to be divorced from politics. And who wants politics to invade everything?
Exactly.
What about all the great writers, the great thinkers, the great musicians, the painters, everything else? It's so much richer. All of our cultures are so much richer than this reductive, boring emancipation game.
Which is profoundly polarizing also. And it brings at the end also, it leads to standardization in the name of diversity, which is for me the most crucial aspect. No?
Well said.
Now, well, just to close, what are you hopeful of the future, and what are your plans? Let's try to finish in a more cheerful way. I hope.
What a question! What a question!
Well, I mean, let's take it. What are your views on the future in many aspects? What your hunch? How do you feel about this?
I just wrote my Spectator column this week, partly on this. There are times, like all of I find neither optimism nor pessimism particularly prevailing as a view. I think there are things which one is optimistic about, things which one is pessimistic about. I just had as a byline. I happened to be speaking recently to a friend in Madrid who said to me something very interesting, which I've taken on board. She said, that line you've used for a while, Douglas, about this being the luckiest generation in history, et cetera, et cetera. It doesn't work anymore. I thought this was a very profound. It was one of those times when somebody you respect says something and you know you should take note.
Yes,
and I think she's completely right. And I know from friends in Spain, particularly in Latin America and elsewhere, young people in particular are in a very, very tricky position now. And the fact that had been true until the last decade, that living standards have continued to rise and much more, this doesn't hold anymore. And it's not quite enough to point to the fact that hundreds of thousands of people every day are taken out of poverty. It doesn't work if everybody has been living in stagnation or decline for over a decade now. And I worry very much about the consequences of this. I think that everybody who's in their teens and their 20s at the moment has reason to feel glum about the world they're going into. The specific things I worry about on that are obviously other than the ones we've talked about today, but I mean, it's the one which we skirted over a bit at the beginning, but is the obvious issue of debt. I think that
employment,
what we've done in the last year may have been the right thing to do. I'm very mixed views about it, but it cannot be something we ever do again. We've run up historic levels of debt for a virus that's not that lethal by the history of pandemics, in the history of pandemics and the history of viruses. And we can't afford to do it again. And my worry is that, in fact, this is what we will do whenever a COVID-like thing emerges.
Exactly.
And I think, furthermore, young people are, it's understandable that they see their life chances being thwarted. They see this burden. They see the very, very considerable difficulty of accruing capital. As I say in The Madness of Crowds in the introduction, there's no obvious reason. I think that capitalism is the best system to further human opportunity. But there's no reason why a young person who cannot accrue capital should have any great instinctive love of capitalism.
Exactly.
And so these people may well be vulnerable to much worse ideas and to, as I say, killing the golden goose. Now, there are answers to this, and I think that we should all think very deeply about them. There are answers that are economic. There are answers that are spiritual, religious. There are answers that are cultural, and much more. But I've found in the last year, among the texts that's meant a lot to me has been one which one of the great Christian writers of the 20th century, C.S. Lewis, issued in a sermon in Oxford in 1939. And this sermon of his, which I reread at the beginning of last year when the coronavirus first struck, maybe I can send you a link and you could even put it under the video.
Yes.
It's a very profound piece of prose because Lewis says in this sermon, the conditions we currently live in are not optimal. But here's the thing, as he says, I'm not quoting directly, I'm summarizing it, but he says, here's the thing, they never were. And he says, if we as human beings had put off the search for beauty and meaning and purpose until the conditions were optimal, then the thing would never have got started.
Exactly.
And as what Lewis points out is, do not in your own life wait for the optimal conditions to emerge before you start to do the thing you ought to do with your life. So if that thing is starting a family or a relationship, don't put it off till the time when things are absolutely stable, because that time may not emerge. If you have work to do, don't delay it a minute longer. And as Lewis says, this extraordinary, the darkest corner of the 20th century, as he says, the history of humanity has been that we behave differently from the animals. The ants made their own decision about what they should do with their time. And we as human beings have always made a different decision. We, as I think Lewis says, we discuss mathematical theorems in dungeons. We talk poetry at the walls of Quebec, comb our hair at the gates of Thermopylae. And as Lewis says, this is not panache, it is our nature. It is our nature as human beings. And in this, I think, lies a very deep truth which we should dwell on, and which I think we should urge particularly young people to consider. There are a lot of people at the moment who are telling people either that things are hopeless or are going to be hopeless as if by some force of nature, and they are not by some force of nature. The conditions may well be very suboptimal around you, but they are no reason to postpone whatever it is that you are going to do with your life. They are no reason to put that off or to delay it or to prevaricate or use it even as an excuse. Because individually as well as collectively, our only way out of the situation that we are now in is what the answer always was, which was for extraordinary men and women, some heralded and some many, many not, to do the great business of humanity. And that is our challenge now, as it has been throughout our history. And I'm as confident as I could be that that will happen, and that great people will come up, heroic people, from a generation which are facing suboptimal conditions, but are the only people capable of making those conditions better.
Well, I think it has been beautifully ended. Thank you for those words. I think they carry a lot of truth. To complement that with, adaptability and purpose. Purpose will also give direction to the youth, I think. Yeah. Douglas, it has been a pleasure. Seriously, I was looking to do this interview for a long, long time, but I didn't have the numbers. I was very little, so I said I'm going to email him. He's just going to ditch me. But I reached my numbers, and I'm a small. I'm getting bulky right now. But thank you very much for your time. It has been a wonderful conversation, and I look forward to your future works, your future presentations, and best of luck for what comes.
It's been a great pleasure. Many thanks, and all the best to all of your listeners.
Thank you. Thank you.